Nobody really paid attention to the boy in the corner. That was just how it was. In a building full of children, all of them loud, all of them needing something, the quiet ones tended to disappear, and he was the quietest of all. He had no memory of ever arriving at the orphanage. He had simply always been there. The way the cracked paint on the walls had always been there. The way the smell of boiled food had always been there. The caretakers called him Elias, a name they had chosen themselves, from a list, the way you might pick a word from a dictionary. It was not given with love. It was given because he needed something to be called. The orphanage sat on the edge of a small town in Eastern Europe. It was not a cruel place. Nobody was unkind on purpose, but it was the kind of place where there were too many children and not enough time. And in that kind of place, the children who made noise got attention, and the children who stayed quiet got forgotten. Elias was very good at staying quiet. He was 8 years old when he first noticed the piano. It sat at the far end of the recreation hall, a long, cold room where children played cards or stared out of foggy windows on rainy days. The piano was pushed against the wall like something that had been put there temporarily and then forgotten about for years. Its wood had gone dark from moisture. The lid over the keys had warped slightly at one end and wouldn't close all the way. A layer of dust sat on top of it so thick that you could write your name in it with your finger and it would stay there for days. Nobody played it. Nobody even walked near it. The other children had decided, without any discussion, that it was simply part of the wall, furniture, background, nothing interesting. One of the older boys once said the thing was broken anyway, and after that everyone accepted it as fact without bothering to check. But Elias looked at it differently. He could not have explained why. There was something about the shape of it. The curve of the wood, the row of keys peeking out from under the warped lid, that felt like it was waiting, like a person sitting on a bench who has been there a long time and is hoping someone will finally sit down beside them. For several days, he only stood near it. He would drift to that end of the room during free hours and stand a few feet away, watching it the way you watch a dog you are not sure about, curious, but careful. None of the other kids noticed. None of the caretakers said anything. He was just standing near a wall. Nothing to see. Then, one afternoon, a gray, rainy Tuesday in late October when most of the other children were napping, he sat down on the piano bench. The bench creaked under his small weight. He sat very still for a moment, as if waiting for someone to tell him to get up. No one came. The room was empty. Outside, rain tapped lightly against the windows. He lifted his right hand and pressed one key. The sound that came out was not pretty. Exactly. The note was slightly off. The piano had not been tuned in years and probably decades. But it was a real sound. A sound with weight to it. It filled the room in a way that surprised him, spreading out into the corners and coming back softer, like an echo from somewhere further away than the walls. He stared at his own finger as if it had done something his brain had not approved. Then he pressed another key. Then another. There was no plan. He had never had a music lesson. He did not know what a note was called, did not know the difference between a sharp and a flat, had never heard the words melody or chord used in a sentence meant for him. He only knew what his ear told him. This one sounds okay after that one. This one does not. He followed the sounds the way you might follow a path through trees, not knowing where it leads but feeling like the direction is right. By the time the other children woke up from their nap, he had found something. A short praise, maybe 6 or 7 notes, that repeated and then changed slightly and then came back again. It was not a song anyone had written. It was his. It had come from the space between his fingers and the old keys in the quiet room, and it belonged to no one else. He came back the next day, and the day after that. Within 2 weeks, both hands were moving. His left hand had figured out, on its own, that it could hold steady notes at the bottom, while the right hand moved. He did not know the word for what his left hand was doing. He only knew it made the whole thing sound fuller, like the difference between one person humming and a small group of people humming together. The other kids still did not care. That suited him perfectly. It was Mrs. Renata who heard him first. She was one of the senior caretakers. A woman in her late 50s, with tired eyes, and a habit of tucking a pen behind her ear, even when she had no reason to. She had worked at the orphanage for over 20 years and had seen many things in that building, most of them hard. She was not a woman who was easily surprised. One morning she was walking past the recreation hall on her way to the supply room when she stopped. She stood in the corridor and tilted her head, the way you do when you are not sure you heard what you think you heard. Then she took 3 quiet steps back toward the hall door, which was slightly open, and looked through the gap. Elias was sitting at the piano with his eyes closed. His hands were moving slowly, finding the notes from memory. The melody, longer now than it had been at the beginning, more developed, more sure of itself, moved through the cold air of the room like something that had been waiting a long time to be let out. Mrs. Renata did not open the door. She did not make a sound. She stood in the corridor with her hand resting on the doorframe and listened until he finished. And then she stood there a little longer, after his hands had gone still, just to be sure she had really heard what she thought she heard. She had worked at that orphanage for over 2 decades. She had watched children come and go. She had seen children who were good at maths, children who were fast runners, children who could tell a joke that made the whole dinner table laugh. But she had never, not once, stood outside a door and felt something move inside her chest the way she felt it then. She did not tell anyone right away. She thought about it for a few days, the way you think carefully about something before you say it out loud and make it real. Then she sat down at the small desk in the back office, took out a piece of paper, and began to write a letter. She was not a fancy writer. She did not use complicated words. She just wrote what she knew, as honestly as she could, that there was a boy in her care, that he had never had a single lesson, that he had taught himself on a broken piano in a cold room, and that when she had listened to him play, she had forgotten, just for a moment, where she was standing. She addressed the letter to the regional music conservatory in the city. She sealed Italiana, she put a stamp on it, and then, without telling a single person, not her colleagues, not her supervisor, certainly not Elias, she walked to the post box at the end of the street and dropped it in. She had no reason to believe anything would come of it. But 3 weeks later, on a cold Tuesday morning, a car pulled up to the orphanage gate. A man in a long coat stepped out, looked up at the building for a moment, and then walked toward the front door. His name was Dr. Kovac. He was a professor of music, and he had driven 2 hours to hear a boy that most of the world had never heard of. Dr. Kovac was not a man who showed surprise easily. He had spent 30 years teaching music at a conservatory. He had heard hundreds of young students play, some of them gifted, some of them merely hardworking, most of them somewhere in between. He had learned, over the years, not to get too excited too quickly. Hope, in his profession, had a way of arriving loudly and then going quiet. So when he walked into the orphanage that cold Tuesday morning and sat down in the recreation hall to listen, he did not expect much. He had come because the letter had been unusual, not because of what it said, but because of how honestly it was written. No exaggeration. No performance. Just a woman saying plainly that she had heard something and did not know what to do with it. That kind of letter was rare enough to be worth 2 hours on the road. Elias did not know who the man was. One of the caretakers had simply told him that a visitor wanted to hear him play. He sat down at the old piano, the same way he always did, without ceremony, without nerves, without any particular awareness that this moment was different from any other. Just played. The same melody he had been building for weeks, now longer and more layered than it had ever been, filling that cold room the way it always did. Dr. Kovac sat with his hands folded in his lap and said nothing for a long time after Elias finished. Then he asked one question. He asked where Elias had learned what he just played. Elias looked at him and said he hadn't learned it anywhere. He said he just found it. Dr. Kovac nodded slowly, the way someone nods when a thing they suspected turns out to be true. He stayed for another hour that day. Before he left, he spoke with the orphanage director for a long time behind a closed door. Nobody knows exactly what was said in that room. What everyone did know was that 2 months later, Elias packed the small bag that held everything he owned and got into the back seat of a car that drove him to the city. He had a full scholarship to the conservatory, the first one ever given to a child with no guardian, no school records, and no documented history beyond a name chosen from a list. The early years of formal training were not easy for him. That part is important to say, because it would be too simple to tell this as a story where everything went smoothly once the door opened. It did not. Elias was bright in a way that made lessons difficult, not because he could not learn, but because his mind kept pulling in its own direction. His teachers would assign him a piece to study, and he would begin it faithfully, sitting at the practice room piano with the sheet music propped in front of him. And then somewhere in the middle of a Chopin etude, his hands would quietly drift away from the page and into something else entirely. Something of his own. as if the assigned music was a road he had agreed to walk on, but his feet kept finding a different path through the grass alongside it. Some of his professors found this frustrating. A few found it fascinating. Most were somewhere in the middle, unsure whether they were watching a discipline problem or something they did not have the right word for yet. Dr. Kovac consistently argued that the boy should be allowed to compose. He was often overruled. The curriculum was the curriculum. There was a structure for a reason. At 14, Iliasas nearly left. There was a period of several months where he grew so tired of being pulled away from his own instincts that he stopped practicing altogether. He sat in classes and ate in the dining hall and went through the motions, but the music in him had gone somewhere private, somewhere even he couldn't quite reach. Dr. Kovac noticed. He did not make a fuss about it. He simply started leaving the practice room unlocked at night, something technically against the rules, and said nothing to Elias about it. He just made sure the boy knew, casually, in passing, that the room was there if he needed it. One night, Elias went in. He sat at the grand piano in the dark practice room for a while without playing anything. Just sitting. The room smelled of old wood and rosin and the particular kind of quiet that buildings have late at night, when everyone else is asleep. And then, without really deciding to, he started playing. Not an exercise. Not an assigned piece. He played the old phrase, the one he had first found on the broken orphanage piano 6 years earlier. On a rainy October afternoon with the other children napping and no one watching. That small, wandering, 6-note question that had started all of this. But this time, his hands did not stop there. They kept going. They built on it the way a river builds on a trickle. Gradually, naturally, without force. For over an hour he played, alone in that dark room, and what came out was not a fragment anymore. It was a full piece. 3 movements, each one connected to the others, each one growing from that same original phrase, the way branches grow from a single trunk. When he finally lifted his hands from the keys, he sat still for a moment and breathed. He had not felt that way in almost a year. Like himself again. Like the music and the boy playing it were the same thing, not 2 separate things in disagreement. He decided to play it at the end of year student recital. He did not tell anyone what he planned. On the program, his name was listed next to a Chopin piece. His professors expected the Chopin. The audience, faculty members, students, a few parents, sitting in padded chairs in a modest recital hall, expected the Chopin. When Elias walked to the piano, sat down, and placed no sheet music on the stand, a few people in the front rows exchanged a glance, but no one said anything. He adjusted the bench. He looked at the keys for a moment, and then he began. The room changed before the first minute was over. It is difficult to describe exactly how. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened was something you feel more than observe. People stopped shifting in their seats. A man near the back who had been discreetly checking his watch put his hand back in his lap. A woman who had leaned over to whisper something to the person beside her slowly straightened up and turned back to the stage. The air in the room became, somehow, heavier and lighter at the same time. Nobody coughed. Nobody moved. For the full length of the piece, nearly 18 minutes, the only sound in that hall was the piano and the boy playing it. When the last note faded, there was silence. Not the silence before applause, where you can feel the audience gathering itself. A different kind. The kind where no one wants to be the first person to make a sound because making a sound would mean it was over, and no one was ready for it to be over. It lasted close to 10 seconds. Then someone in the third row began to clap, and the rest of the room followed. A faculty member had recorded part of the performance on her phone, slightly shaky. The audio not perfect, the camera angle catching the side of Elias's face, and the movement of his hands, more than anything else. She shared it the following day within the conservatory's internal network, with a short note saying only that people should watch it. Within 3 days it had been passed outside the conservatory. Within 2 weeks it had reached an international forum for classical music, where a thread about it ran to hundreds of comments from people in a dozen different countries. Within a month, a representative from a recording label in Vienna had made contact with the conservatory. Elias was 15 years old. When the recording contract was being discussed, he made one request. He did not ask for money. He did not ask about which concert halls he might one day play in. He asked that when the time came to go into the studio and record the piece properly, with good microphones and real acoustics and everything done right. Mrs. Renata be there in the room. She came. She sat in a chair just inside the studio door, her hands folded in her lap, the same pen tucked behind her ear out of habit. She watched him settle onto the bench, adjust the microphone position, nod at the sound engineer, and then, exactly as she had done years ago, standing in a drafty corridor with her hand on a doorframe, she went very still and she listened. After the session, a journalist who was writing a piece about Elias asked him the question people kept asking: where did the music come from? How did he first find it? He thought about the question for a moment, genuinely thought about it, the way he always did before he said anything, and then he answered quietly. He said it came from a piano no one was using. The old upright instrument was eventually tracked down. It was still in the orphanage recreation hall, pushed against the same wall, still slightly warped at the lid, still carrying dust the way it always had. A restoration team spent several weeks bringing it back, cleaning it, restringing it, tuning it properly, for what may have been the first time in its entire existence. When it was done, it was donated to a music program for children in state care. On the inside of the lid, someone had a small plaque fitted into the wood. It did not say anything about Elias. It did not mention fame or recordings or concert halls or any of the things that came after. It said only 7 words. This piano heard him first.